got something that might interest you.
Resident Evil is Capcom's most successful franchise in the company's long history, and I thought now that Capcom has released their updated sales figures for the Resident Evil franchise, let's rank these games based on their sales. We are looking at the vast majority of Resident Evil titles ever made available, including lesser-known titles like Resident Evil Deadly Silence, Dead Aim, and more. But we're not going to be covering the online-only titles, mobile games, pachinko games, etc. Yeah, there are a bunch of those. One thing of note before we begin, the number of sales a game has achieved does not reflect a game's quality. You are going to see some games here that may surprise you with how high or low they are in the ranking. And just know that you alone are the one to make the judgment if a game is good for you or not. This ranking was procured from Capcom's website and VGSales.com, since Capcom's website only includes games that have sold at least 1 million copies. You can find my sources linked in the description at your convenience. Alright, we've got 25 games to go through, so let's waste no more time and get straight into the list. Coming in dead last as the Resident Evil game that sold the least amount of copies, Resident Evil Dead Aim comes in with 40,000 total copies sold. With an interesting blend of third-person traversal and first-person shooting, this unique shooter was one of the rare Resident Evil titles that had PS2 light gun support. This unique hybrid of the two systems made this game pretty memorable for those who played the Resident Evil Survivor series, but ultimately underperformed when compared to the other first-person Resident Evil titles that came before it. In at 24 with 119,000 copies sold is the second Resident Evil Survivor title, Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica. Unlike Dead Aim that came before it, Survivor 2 Code Veronica plays solely in first person, tasking players to play through sections based off Code Veronica in a first-person shooter format with more of an emphasis on the action over the horror. The game also had light gun support, which was deemed the best way to play this game. While this Survivor game features the setting adapted from Resident Evil Code Veronica, featuring enemies and characters from that game, its condensed nature doesn't make it a proper substitute for those who haven't played Code Veronica. Rather, it fittingly serves as a companion piece. Interestingly, this game sold considerably better than Dead Aim, even though the game never saw a release in North America. Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles is next, with having sold 145,000 units. This follow-up to Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles is a terrific light gun style game made for the Wii and later ported to the PS3 via a compilation pack. Featuring a plethora of campaigns, including my personal favorite with Jack Krauser and Leon S. Kennedy in the Operation Javier chapter, there's a lot of game here to enjoy, especially if you are more of a fan of the Resident Evil light gun style games. It's too bad that the game sold much less than the Umbrella Chronicles, because I wouldn't doubt we would have seen a lot more Resident Evil titles in this style of game. Do you like the Mercenaries mode? Like, do you want an entire game featuring the Mercenaries? Well, here you go, with Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D for the 3DS having sold 166,000 copies. I had an awesome time with this one, as this was one of the earlier 3DS titles. Choosing between an incredible amount of Resident Evil characters across tons of different maps spanning the franchise, and you have a fun arcade-style game that you can take with you on the go. I'm curious to see how well this game would perform if it were available on more platforms. But hey, if you've got a 3DS or an emulator, definitely go check this one out. Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 is next, coming in at around 200,000 units sold. Adding 5 new scenarios with the original 8 characters returning from Resident Evil Outbreak, this game put players back in the T-virus infested Raccoon City. Serving more as an expansion than an entirely new game, it's understandable that this game managed to sell only a fraction of what Resident Evil Outbreak sold. That said, Outbreak is an awesome game, and if Capcom were thinking about more multiplayer Resident Evil titles in the future, the Outbreak series is one worth looking back to for inspiration. And the final first-person shooter Resident Evil title, Resident Evil Survivor for the original PlayStation, comes in at number 20 with 484,000 games sold. The one that started the Survivor series, this PS1 game deviated from what Resident Evil was known for at the time, and instead pit players against a lot more zombies and enemies from Resident Evil in a first-person shooter format. For regions outside of the North American release, players could use a light gun controller to shoot at enemies. It really is a unique game, and having sold just shy of 500,000 copies for this new style of Resident Evil game, Capcom greenlit more titles like this, but those titles that eventually released never were able to live up to the sales of the game that started this new format. Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles took that first-person format but stuck solely to traditional light gun gameplay, and it paid off. Selling 1.3 million copies in its lifetime, this Resident Evil game is the most successful light gun style Resident Evil game by a large margin, focusing on numerous campaigns following classic encounters and moments from the earlier Resident Evil games, like the train sequence from Resident Evil 0 and Hunk's 4th Survivor mode from Resident Evil 2, to name but a few. This game had a lot of excellent shooting to be had and was made more fun with a friend in 2-player co-op. The game was later released on the PS3 for its Move controller support, and a compilation with its sequel, Resident Evil: The Dark Side Chronicles. Resident Evil Outbreak brought cooperative play to the Resident Evil franchise and was considered a success, having sold 1.4 million copies. Bringing to the table 8 characters with unique abilities, a variety of missions set within Raccoon City during the events of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, and sporting both single-player and cooperative play, this Resident Evil game is often considered the best multiplayer Resident Evil game among those who played it. In today's climate, with the internet being readily available, a remake or a game similar to this style would probably do quite well, as this was one of the premier console games to feature online multiplayer on the PS2. The squad-based third-person shooter in Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City landed this title a sales figure of 2.7 million units. Taking place during the events of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, Operation Raccoon City was a non-canon game that had players shoot down hordes of zombies across Raccoon City in squad-based third-person shooting. Across the game, there were 12 playable characters, sporting unique loadouts, and feature some scenarios that series fans know quite well, most notably being Hunk's USS Alpha Team on his mission to secure the G-Virus from scientist William Birkin. While many didn't enjoy the game, we at least got Hunk in there, so give him some love by taking a look at this video going into his badass backstory. Resident Evil Code Veronica, the game many of us would love to see remade, comes in with 2.9 million units sold. I am grouping the original Dreamcast game with Resident Evil Code Veronica X, an enhanced version of the original, because they are largely the same game, with Code Veronica X just sporting slightly better graphics with some additional cutscenes. Taking place on Rockford Island amidst a T-virus outbreak, players take control of Claire and Chris Redfield in this memorable Resident Evil game. First pioneering camera angles that would track the player as they move about a play space instead of the static camera angles that the series was previously known for, this was considered a big leap for the series at the time. True to Resident Evil fashion, this game also featured some of the most memorable and corny voice acting, solidifying this one as an instant classic and one that would definitely benefit from a remake. Coming in at 3.5 million units sold, the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was an action blockbuster that cranked both the number of zombies and the tension to unseen heights in the series at that point. Following Jill Valentine as she tries to escape the wrath of Nemesis hunting her down all throughout Raccoon City in a plot that runs parallel to the events of Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 is a much adored game that wrapped up the original Resident Evil trilogy nicely. It just so happens to have featured the greatest jump scare in all of Resident Evil, and if you'd like to learn more about the scariest moments in the series, definitely consider checking this video out here on your screen. Make sure to bring some popcorn. Bringing the claustrophobic and tight corridors back into Resident Evil Revelations found success with 3.9 million units sold. An excellent game that took full advantage of the 3DS when it launched. The game has been ported and enhanced to other platforms since, and has been winning fans over with its great gameplay, intriguing and haunting setting, creepy enemy designs, and introducing us to the T-Abyss virus and its haunting lore. This game is great, and I definitely recommend picking it up if you're in the mood for some modern Resident Evil with a classic feel. Another banger and excellent follow-up to Revelations, Resident Evil Revelations 2 attracted even more players with its 4.1 million units sold. Releasing episodically when it first launched, Revelations 2 proved that an intricate co-op experience can do quite well in Resident Evil, with players controlling Claire Redfield and a few other supporting characters as they make their way through eerie settings like dense forests, asylums, and dilapidated villages. Revelations 2 introduced to players some of the most haunting and twisted designs in Resident Evil with the T-Phobos virus, a virus that mutates its victims after extreme exposure to stress and fear. Want to learn more about it? Check out this video here for the top 10 deadliest viruses and infections throughout Resident Evil. Speaking of bad viruses, the T-virus and especially the G-virus come in here aplenty with the original Resident Evil 2, having sold 4.96 million copies. Resident Evil 2 is survival horror perfection, introducing players to franchise veterans like Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield for the first time. Resident Evil 2 features 2 complete and distinct campaigns with incredible replayability, featuring some of the most iconic settings in all of survival horror. Its remake is great, and so is the original, so it's hard to imagine how this game didn't sell as well as the original that started it all. We're not quite yet at the original Resident Evil, but we are touching on the most recent Resident Evil yet in Resident Evil 4 Remake, still selling well and landing at 5 million units sold mere months after its release. This one will undoubtedly land much higher on this list in time, especially when Ada's Separate Ways DLC lands in the future. But yeah, what else is there to say about this one? It's a fantastic game, remaking one of the greatest campaigns of all time, all while redefining third-person shooting in the process. This action horror game is one you need not miss out on. Resident Evil 0 comes in with 5.05 million units sold, a respectable number, seeing as the original GameCube release only sold 1.25 million, with the rest of the sales being held up by the PS3 and PS4 era HD remasters. Following Rebecca Chambers and partner Billy Cohen, Resident Evil 0 takes place before the events of the first game. This is a challenging one, tasking players to manage resources across these 2 different characters while overcoming all manner of hostile enemies. It would be cool to see this game get a remake, seeing as it is one of the most overlooked in the franchise. As Resident Evil 0 is the first game chronologically in the franchise, the one that started it all, Resident Evil, is perhaps the most significant. It is known as the father of survival horror games, after all. Selling a whopping 5.3 million units, Resident Evil, along with its Director's Cut editions and the often forgotten version for the Nintendo DS, Resident Evil Deadly Silence, and heck, the Game Boy game Resident Evil Gaiden, all made the original Resident Evil land where it is today. Resident Evil was a fantastic game, introducing players to many of the characters we know and love today, like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Albert Wesker, to name but a few. There truly was never a game like it at the time, and while the game can still be enjoyed today, its remake improves upon the original game in nearly every conceivable way. Resident Evil Remake, the 2002 remake of the original game, managed to sell 6.1 million copies. Like Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil Remake launched exclusively on the GameCube for its release and managed to sell 1.35 million copies, but sold much better when the game ultimately was remastered and re-released for the PS3 and PS4 era of platforms, along with a Wii release. Resident Evil Remake is fantastic, while still maintaining the classic feel of the original trilogy with its tank controls and fixed camera perspectives. The graphics were greatly enhanced, adding new enemy types into the mix, a new side story featuring one of the most haunting sections in Resident Evil with Lisa Trevor, and more quality of life updates. Resident Evil Remake is pretty great. While some may not give such praise to this remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake has sold 7.6 million units to date. An action blockbuster like its original counterpart, but missing some key components from that game, Resident Evil 3 Remake is still an enjoyable one to play. It's got great action, the game looks great, and it introduces some of the newer fans to Jill's chapter of the Raccoon City incident. It is certainly worth a play for those who haven't played it yet, seeing as the game constantly gets featured in sales. The latest of the mainline Resident Evil games, Resident Evil Village sits comfortably at 8.3 million units sold. Like Resident Evil 4 Remake, I expect this one to break 10 million at some point, but even if it doesn't, Resident Evil Village still rocks. RE Village is the second chapter of Ethan Winter's saga, except this time we find him and his family in a remote village in Europe with some truly unruly villains. Featuring a solid mix of action with some incredible horror elements in isolated spots, Resident Evil Village is an amalgamation of various parts of Resident Evil, proving to be a memorable journey and doubly so if played in VR. Breaking the top 5 and entering the 10 million club, Resident Evil 6 sits comfortably at 11.9 million units sold. This incredibly ambitious game introduced to us 4 unique campaigns with co-op, an incredible Mercenaries mode, and the C-Virus, one of the most lethal ever featured in the series. Taking place in a variety of locations with fan-favorite characters, Resident Evil 6 does a lot, but to many, doesn't do it right. I had a good time with the game, and although I wouldn't say it's among my favorites, it's worth checking out. Did I mention that the Mercenaries mode kicks ass? I don't think we've seen that mode hit the highs it did since this one. Talk about a complete 180 from Resident Evil 6, and you get Resident Evil 7. With a very commendable 12.4 million units sold, RE7 was a true reinvention of the franchise. Taking the perspective into first person while going back to the survival horror elements established in the first few games in the series, RE7 was the breath of fresh air we were all craving. The new direction it went in, along with the memorable encounters with the frenzied bakers across the mansion and beyond in the southern bayous, made this Resident Evil game one of the most successful RE titles of all time. This direction paid off big time for Capcom, and so too did the next one.
I've never seen anything like it. I haven't been able to sleep since that night. You gotta stay strong.
The remake that started the modern RE remakes we've come to know today, Resident Evil 2 Remake, struck early 2019 with as much ferocity as Mr. X being denied entry into this safe room. Selling an incredible 12.6 million units, Resident Evil 2 Remake remade easily one of the best Resident Evil games out there and presented it in the third-person over-the-shoulder format. Completely remade from the ground up, Resident Evil 2 Remake sports completely redone graphics, new gameplay, and various tweaks to bosses and areas from the original. It may not be a one-to-one remake, but this game is incredible and masterfully recreates Leon and Claire's campaigns for modern systems. Yeah, I too missed the B scenarios of the original, but hey, beggars can't be choosers. There's no denying Resident Evil 2 Remake is a damn fine game. Alright, for the top 2. This may come as a surprise to you, but even with being available on almost every single platform out there, the original Resident Evil 4 comes in second place with a whopping 12.8 million units sold. Yeah, that's right, just 200,000 more than Resident Evil 2 Remake. But that will likely change with time. Resident Evil 4 was made available on just about every platform, from its original GameCube release to the PS2, PS3 era, PS4 era, PC, Wii, even mobile devices, and the MetaQuest 2 for VR. This game is everywhere and is an incredible game at that. The game that truly shifted directions for Capcom and saved the franchise, with every Resident Evil game performing a bit worse until Resident Evil 4 released. This game single-handedly gave birth to the modern third-person shooters and brought Resident Evil to scores of new people who otherwise weren't interested in Resident Evil prior. While not everyone loved the direction it went with its fourth mainline entry, RE4 is an absolute classic and is a big reason why the next game sold so well.
You don't know what you're talking about! You can all go to hell!
Wait a minute. That's the...
Resident Evil 5, one of the most contested entries in the entire franchise, is known for having sold the most copies in Resident Evil history, with having sold 14.7 million units across all platforms to date. Having sold 8.8 million units from the PS3 and Xbox 360 alone, with a couple million from the Gold Edition for those very platforms, the PC release, and the PS4 and Xbox One remaster, Resident Evil 5 marks the current pinnacle of sales in the coveted Resident Evil series. Now, this could very well change, but as it stands, RE5 is at the top in terms of sales. Resident Evil 5 takes us to Africa with Chris Redfield and series newcomer Sheva Alomar in a co-op focused game sporting some of the most action-heavy moments in all of the franchise. Featuring an awesome Mercenaries mode and some great campaign DLC, RE5 is a solid game that no wonder was fueled coming off the hype and greatness generated by Resident Evil 4 that came before it. Now that you know what are currently the best-selling games in Resident Evil, I want you to let me know what surprised you most about this list. Did you think certain games were going to be ranking higher or lower than they currently are? I'd love to hear all about it in the comments, and after you're done, go check this video out about some of the scariest moments in all of Resident Evil, ranked from least scary to the most terrifying. Thank you all for the awesome support, and I will see you real soon in the next one.